It gives me great pleasure to introduce Sondra Baras from the heartland of Israel. She lives in the mountains of Israel, and she's in fact director of Christian Friends of Israeli Communities Heartland. And I'm sure Sondra is going to tell us a lot about that. And also in this season, which is Passover, she's also going to give us a little glimpse of what the importance of that is for her and her community. Sondra is a Bible teacher too, and I think it's each week she actually produces a Zoom teaching on the Torah, and these are available on their website, and there's little YouTube clips of teachings from Sondra which are available. Because we are meeting on Shabbat, we're making this recording in advance so we don't actually break any Shabbat laws. So, Sondra, it's great to welcome you to Hanasim, and over to you.
Okay. Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you, John, for inviting me. And it's always a pleasure for me to meet and speak to people around the world who love Israel, Christians in particular. Just a few words about myself. I am originally from the United States, as you can probably tell from my accent. I'm an Orthodox Jew, grew up in a very Jewish home, and part of that meant connecting to the Bible very, very early on. And for me as a Jew growing up with this very deep biblical connection, as I got a bit older, I was a teenager, and I learned about Israel, the modern state of Israel. It to me was absolutely a no-brainer that, of course, if I'm Jewish and I'm following God's commandments and I'm trying to be sensitive and listen to what God is doing in the world today, it was clear for me that He is bringing the people of Israel home to the land of Israel. And as one of those people of Israel, it was just something that I knew I needed to do. And thank God, my husband felt the same way when it came time to actually doing it. We were a young family. We were married a few years. We have two children who were both very little at that point, and we moved to Israel. And that was almost 38 years ago. And we had 3 more children in Israel. And today we have been blessed with 10 grandchildren and another one on the way. So, for me, what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about the Bible, we're going to talk about the land of Israel, we're going to talk about Judea and Samaria, and I'll refer to biblical verses and throw in a bit of history, but it's all very personal for me as well, because I really do believe that what we are witnessing today, all of us around the world, all those who read the Bible, whether Jewish or Christian, I think it is obvious, it's apparent to anyone who has eyes to see and ears to hear that we are in a miraculous time, and that God is today fulfilling promises He made thousands of years ago. And if anybody doubts whether there truly is a God of Israel, and if anyone doubts whether it is the God of Israel who wrote the Bible, I think just, look out your windows and the proof is there, because there's no other precedent for a book that is written thousands of years earlier that predicts something that's going to happen, and it happens. So we know that the God of Israel is behind all of that. So anyway, I just want to start a bit about the land of Israel and give perhaps a bit of background on that, a bit of teaching. To me, where do I live? I moved to Israel. That was very important to me. But it wasn't enough for us to just come to Israel and settle in one of the large cities and just go about our business. With the kind of awareness we had that, we are in a time of unbelievable fulfillment of prophecy. And for us, actually, we would call it the beginning of the final redemption. Jews and Christians are both looking towards a Messiah. You think He's been, I think He hasn't yet, but, we all, I think, are looking forward to this different kind of time. And we believe that we're in the beginnings of that time right now, signaled by the fact that the state of Israel is coming to being, that there's now an independent state, which is a Jewish state in the land of Israel. So that certainly we're on our way. Now, if we look a bit in Israeli history, In 1948, when Israel became a state, we did not have all of Israel. And unfortunately, right away, Israel was attacked on all sides, and we had to defend ourselves even before we had an army or an air force. And actually, there's some amazing books that have been written recently that are just, there was one I read about something about this, how the Israeli Air Force began. And there were just volunteer airmen that came, people who were veterans of World War II, and they were buying airplanes that were so rickety that they were practically putting them together with Band-Aids, and the amazing sacrifice that these people were willing to, put forward to try to save the state of Israel before it even came into being. So that was just such a miraculous time. But unfortunately, while we did become a state, the middle of Israel, what we call the heartland of Israel, the places that biblically are referred to as Judea and Samaria, and that is referred to today, unfortunately, incorrectly by so much of the world as the West Bank. This area was not part of Israel. It was illegally occupied by Jordan. It includes such biblical places as Shechem, Hebron, Bethlehem. It included at the time the original old city of Jerusalem, and the parts of Jerusalem northeast and south of the old city. The only part of Jerusalem that was in Israel's hands before 1967 was the small western part of Jerusalem. This, though, at least we had a state, so nobody was standing around mourning this. On the other hand, in 1967, Jordan attacked Israel, and Israel repelled that attack, and in so doing, drove the Jordanians out of this very area. And so it is only since 1967 that Jews have been able to come back to Judea and Samaria. And as I'm sure you can appreciate, and I'll just refer to some biblical verses on this particular issue. It's not enough to say, oh, how nice, we have a new piece of territory. Let's maybe put a few military bases there. Let's go out and take a visit, take some pictures, go home. Just think about what God says to Joshua. One of the first commandments that Joshua was given, and it's in Joshua 1, verse 3. Every place where you will put or you will tread with the sole of your foot, that place I will give to you, as I spoke to Moses. And indeed, he gave a very similar instruction to Moses. And what that meant was, even though God said he was going to give the land to the nation of Israel, and much of the conquest of the land of Israel was accompanied by miracles. People very often, when they think about Joshua, they think about parting of the Jordan River to enable the nation of Israel to cross, and the conquest of Jericho, which is completely miraculous. They walk around the walls a few times and they blow on some trumpets and the walls come tumbling down, and there's even a song about that, and it's all great. Okay. But that was just the entrance to the land. The rest of the conquest had to be done by human action. There was armies, there was strategies, there was chasing kings and, all over the place and capturing them. And it was the act of war. Now, there's no question there were some miracles. Joshua needed a little more time to finish a battle. So he said, God, please make the sun stand still so that we can have a longer day. Yes, but people had to do something. And I think what is represented in this verse to Joshua is, you cannot stand at the entrance to the land of Israel and say, voila, okay, all mine. You're going to have to actually put your foot down. You're going to have to walk, and you're going to have to make it yours, okay? And we see this also in Ezekiel. And this is a prophecy that many, many people refer to when they're talking about, what we are witnessing today. It is a prophecy that gives us a lot of context, okay? And that's Ezekiel 36, which significantly is addressed to the mountains of Israel. Now, this is where I live, in Judea and Samaria, that area that people call the West Bank. This is the mountains of Israel. Tel Aviv and that area along Netanya, Ashkelon, I don't know which places you've been to, but that area along the coast of Israel, along the Mediterranean, is not a mountain. It's at sea level. And on the eastern edge of Israel, along the Jordan River, is not only not sea level, it's way below sea level, between 300 and 400 meters below sea level. It's very, very low. And the Dead Sea, of course, you know, is the lowest place on earth. Sea of Galilee isn't exactly high either. So this is not the mountains of Israel. In between, okay, in between the coastal plain and the Jordan Valley, in the middle is these mountains. That's the mountains of Israel, and that's Judea and Samaria. It is also the mountains of the Galilee. Okay, but for our purposes, we're talking about Judea and Samaria. And so in Ezekiel 36, Ezekiel talks about the restoration of Israel. Okay, and he addresses himself to the mountains of Israel. In verse 8, he says, "You, O mountains of Israel, shoot forth your branches and bear your fruit for my people Israel, for they are soon to come." And you know, of course, this is a very exciting declaration. And in Ezekiel time, it was far away from happening. Okay, and it's in Ezekiel's time that the whole northern kingdom, which is all of Samaria, had already been destroyed, and the tribes from there were dispersed all over and lost. So for him to prophesy in that way, he's clearly looking into a distant future, and that distant future is us, is today. And look at verse 10, where God promises, "I will multiply upon you man, all the house of Israel. The cities will be resettled and the ruins will be rebuilt." And I think here again, we have an obvious relationship between human endeavor and God's miracles and promises. Because God does not bring houses down from the heavens. He is clearly saying here that the people, human beings, okay, first he says, "I'll multiply upon you man," okay? What is that man supposed to do? The man is supposed to build the cities and build the ruins and resettle the cities. And that's exactly what we are doing today. So if we have this situation in 1967, a war that we did not ask for, a war that was forced on Israel, yet taking advantage of that opportunity, driving, repelling the attack, of course, was necessary for our survival, getting rid of Jordan to the other side of the Jordan River, which is where they are today and where they've been ever since. But, here we have this land. What are we supposed to do with it? So if we follow the examples given to us here, both by Joshua and by Ezekiel, we understand that it is us to walk into that land, to settle that land, to rebuild the ruins and settle the cities. And that's exactly what we've done. This is the meaning of the settlement movement that began shortly after the 6-Day War and has continued to this very day. And I'll just want to refer to one more biblical verse that it's something I very often start with, but it's clearly very, very fundamental. And that is in Genesis 12. Until the first 11 chapters of Genesis are actually what I call the universal part of the Bible, because it is talking about the creation of the world and the birth of nations. And it's only when we get to chapter 12 that we learn about the birth of the nation of Israel with the selection of Abraham. And God says to Abraham, "Go forth from your country, from your birthplace, from the house of your father, to the land that I will show you." And at this point, he's really unaware what land it is, what his destiny is. All he knows is he's been given this call from God to leave behind what he knows and is familiar with and go to this unknown place. In the end of verse 5, we learn that he passed through the land of Canaan, that he left to go towards the land of Canaan, and he got to the land of Canaan. In verse 6, Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. The Canaanites were then in the land. The Lord appeared to Abraham, saying, "I will give this land to your children." He built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. So at this point, Abraham is, God reveals the secret, the ultimate plan to Abraham. And he says, "Okay, here you've arrived. You are now in the land of Canaan. You're at the oak of Moreh. You can look out," and I invite anybody listening to this to join me in Israel, and we can go out to that very same place. And you look around and you see much of the land of Israel. And at that point, God says, "Take a look. This is the land that I will be giving to your children." And of course, that promise is repeated several times more to Abraham and then to Isaac and to Jacob. And God makes it very clear that there's a process of selection going on here. not just that Abraham was selected, but of his two sons, only Isaac is selected to continue this with this promise. And out of Isaac's two sons, only Jacob is selected. And of course, once we hit Jacob, all of the children of Jacob become the nation of Israel. Jacob's name is actually changed to Israel, and that becomes his national name. And all of his children become the 12 tribes of Israel. So, that, and of course, the Bible continues from then and talking about the land and the people and the obligations of the nation to God. And it's always, but always surrounding the land. If God, when he refers also at the end of Leviticus, and again at the end of Deuteronomy and other places as well, but in those two places you have actually the text of covenants. And in both cases, those covenants spell out the connection between the God of Israel, the people of Israel, and the land of Israel in a very formal, legal way. God has given us a commandments, obligations, and we are supposed to, we owe this to God. That's our obligation, to obey God, to obey his commandments, certainly not to worship pagan gods. This is a big deal, okay? And God in return is telling us that if we obey his commandments, we will prosper in the land. And so many of the blessings that we read about are about how the land will give us bounty. On the other hand, if we disobey God, if we follow pagan gods, if we are bad people, immoral people, whatever, then God will throw us out of the land. And so it's always that connection between us and God is all very much tied up with our connection to the land. And finally, and this I think will be the last verse that I'm going to refer to today, and then we'll move on talking about more 21st century kind of stuff. In Deuteronomy 11, there is an addendum to all of these promises, because you may recall that God promised Abraham that the land will be for his children as an everlasting possession. And yet we have these covenants that talk about a possibility, not just a possibility, but a probability, as we see, that the nation will sin, and therefore they will be thrown out of the land. So how does that work? If the land is your everlasting possession, and yet you're going to get thrown out of the land, how does that come together? Well, in Deuteronomy 30, we see that God promises that he will restore the nation. Look at verse 3. The Lord your God will restore you. He will have mercy on you. He will gather you from all the nations from which the Lord your God has dispersed you. Even if you will have been dispersed to the ends of the earth, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will bring you. And the Lord your God will bring you to the land that your fathers inherited, and you will inherit it, and you will prosper and multiply more than your fathers. And this indeed I see as the original promise that God makes that is for eternity. There may be a long time that you'll be out of the land, God says, but eventually God will gather us back. And so if we look at Ezekiel 36, basically that prophecy is just a detail based on this original promise. And we have so many promises and I'm just using these two examples, but you'll see there are promises that God originally makes to the nation of Israel in the desert before they're coming into the land of Israel, having to do with these kinds of things. And later on, when the prophets go into this in far more detail, talking about particular times, particular people, particular nations, all this is really fleshing out this original promise. God already laid the foundation and then sent his prophets to remind the nation to use these prophecies to perhaps stimulate them to repentance or to give them a sense of what is going to happen. So where does that leave me today? As a Jew and as a passionate Zionist, as I mentioned earlier, it was very clear to me that I needed to come to Israel, to move to Israel with my family. But for me also, to witness, in my own life. Now, I was not born when the state of Israel was created, but I was a young girl during the miraculous victory of 1967. And to see that for my own eyes and to follow that and see how young people of faith were being inspired by these verses that I shared with you today and others, recognizing that The Six-Day War was actually an amazing opportunity. I would even say it was a gift. It's more than a miracle. It was a gift. God gave us the gift of this additional land. And it's not just additional land. It's not just some extra territory. You know, in Britain, you have territories elsewhere. Okay. And America has territories elsewhere. Okay. This is not territory. This is the heart and soul of the country. This is the center. The very place where God first promised the land to Abraham, what we read in Genesis 12, takes place at the Oak of Moreh. This very place was in Jordan's hands before 1967. You have people today saying, oh, you know, West Bank, whatever, what does that have to do with Israel? Well, if any part of Israel is connected to the Jewish people, then certainly the very place where God first promised that land. And so to come back to that place was just something that to me was like, this is what we need to do. And as soon as we landed in Israel, we knew about this place, a new community that was starting in Karnei Shomron, which is where I live. And it was like a new neighborhood, a new hill that was being developed. And we signed up literally within weeks of landing in Israel. We'd already signed up, signed a contract, put down our money or some of our money, and began building our home. And so here we are. We've been living in this home. This is where we raised our children. And but all along, you know, here it is. I'm living in a place that so many people in the world say is illegally occupied by Israel, and they don't understand. You know, over the years, I started doing this as a volunteer when I was a young mother with small children. I'd get these calls, you know, from you know, there's no internet then, and whatever, no emails, but I would get these phone calls from press bureaus and journalists from all over the world. My name was put out there as someone who spoke English and it could articulate, you know, why it is that these crazy settlers want to live there. And there's no question, if I started with Abraham, I would have been scoffed at, you know. So, but believe me, we're not going to go into that today. We don't have time, but there are plenty of legal and historical and political reasons that justifies Israel's claim to this area. But we didn't convince anybody, because when somebody goes into this with this idea that the Jews are wrong, it's going to be very hard to convince them, no matter how many facts you have in your arsenal. And so we needed to be strong. We needed to be convinced that we were doing the right thing. And frankly, legal arguments are great, but biblical arguments are powerful. And if you know, as I do, okay, that you are doing the right thing, that you are participating in something so much bigger than yourself. You're just this little teeny person doing your little teeny bit in what is this amazing process of redemption and fulfillment of prophecy. I mean, who needs more than that, you know? And I have to say that God has blessed our efforts. You know, I remember when I first signed a contract here. Now, my parents at the time were still living in the States. And my parents were passionate Zionists, like I was, except for one thing. They did not plan to move to Israel. They since moved to Israel because all their children did. But, you know, they loved Israel desperately, but they said, oh, it's a little too hard for us to actually move. And, you know, they were already adults when the state of Israel came into being. So it was a little more difficult for them, but they were very passionate Zionists and very supportive of the idea of settling in Judea and Samaria. But at the same time, you know, they saw themselves as very practical, as most people are, right? I also like to think I'm practical. It's just very funny because when you balance practical and God, somehow the God, you know, takes precedence, you know, and it's amazing because God can be very practical too. So I remember when I first brought them out to Karnei Shomron, where I live now, but there was like, they hadn't finished any of the houses yet, you know, so there was some houses being started, there was some shells of the homes and it was under construction and it was still like no pavement or anything like that. And I said, okay, this is where we're going to live. Okay. And then I said, yeah, and you know, it's in Samaria. And then my father says to me in a very practical kind of voice, I'm very concerned, he says, because everyone's talking about the fact that Israel is for sure going to have to pull out of this area, give it all back to the Arabs, and you've just plunked your life savings into this. What's going to happen? So of course I got very angry and I said, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. God promised us it's not going to happen. And they says, yeah, but what if it does? And I said, well, I think the government of Israel will give us back, which they will. But it was such, to me, it was just so obvious it's not going to happen. Now, I'm not saying bad things have not happened. And unfortunately, we did have a real setback, back in 2005, when the communities in the Gaza Strip were removed. And that was a tremendous thing. Of course, that is not the same heart of biblical Israel as Judea and Samaria. It's a slightly different, category, although it was heartbreaking by any means. But, for me, I can look and see actually today, when we first moved to Israel, there were 80,000 Jews living in all of Judea and Samaria and Gaza. Today, there are close to 500,000. Okay, so I look at that and I say, yes, I am bringing practical now. God is being practical because God is working through us human beings who are building and developing and having children. And our children now are moving here and building their own homes and moving into homes. And it's such an amazing process that God is blessing. And when we see those numbers, when we see, if you look behind me, you see trees, okay? I planted those trees when I moved here. There was nothing here. I planted those trees and they're now big trees and they give us wonderful shade in these very hot days. These are the kinds of things when I look at that and I say, yes, we're doing the right thing and God is blessing our efforts. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have to face challenges. I mean, as we're speaking, this past 2 weeks, 11 Israelis were murdered. Mostly in the cities, not even in Judea and Samaria, but Arabs coming from here have found all kinds of ways to get into Israel with guns. I mean, it's terrible what's been going on. If you listen to the language, we have just now entered the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. And this, for some reason, even though it's a holy month, which you would assume would be devoted to prayer and repentance and the kinds of things that Jews and Christians do when we have a holy time, unfortunately, not all, but too many Muslims see this as an opportunity to how do we murder as many Jews as possible. And so we continue dealing with these challenges and on a practical level. That means that the communities in Judea and Samaria, which, by the way, today there are over 150 communities. Okay, some are small, some are large, and some are in between. They all have to have security cameras so that they can spot that terrorist who's about to enter the community. They all have to have, just things for ordinary life. We want people to move here, but we're not saying move here and there will be nothing for you. We want to make sure we have services for senior citizens. We want to make sure we have good schools. We want playgrounds for the children. We want all kinds of things. And this is what has been part of our challenge. Of course, the most threatening life-saving issues are things like security cameras and other security-related issues that we've been very involved with. But this is really what has been so amazing with Christian Friends of Israeli Communities. Now, this is an organization I helped found 24 years ago. It was not my idea, though. I had been advocating for the communities in Judea and Samaria for a number of years already, initially as a volunteer and later on in a Jewish organization. And here and there, I would encounter Christians. I mentioned earlier about when you do an interview with some kind of a media outlet, you can't start talking about Abraham because they will laugh at you. But in this occasional meeting that I would have from time to time with the Christian group, and I threw in a bit of Abraham, all of a sudden, hallelujah, wow, this is it, we get it. And little by little, I came to recognize that Christians who love Israel are our most important ally around the world. And there was actually a Christian who had this idea, you need to be doing this with Christians. And I said, huh? Are they interested? Of course, I discovered over this last 24 years that they're very interested and have been very supportive. So if I'll just take another few minutes to talk about the work of Christian Friends of Israeli Communities. This is an organization that I helped to found. And it is a work that goes from here in Samaria, representing Judea and Samaria. From here, we are sending our messages out to Christians all over the world. The most important part of that work, of course, is educating, and I hope I moved a little bit in that direction this morning, educating you to why we're here and the meaning of what we are doing here in Judea and Samaria. And then, of course, we've been very involved in bringing Christians into the land to enable them to see Judea and Samaria. We are just now starting that again after 2 years of complete shutdown in all tourism to Israel. Now people are starting to come back again. So we have our own tours, but we also work with tours coming from all over the world to give them a Judea and Samaria experience. And, I encourage any of you who are on a tour or wanting to come on a tour to get in touch with me, and I can direct you in the right direction for that. And that, of course, is a very important part of our educational work as well. And lastly, we are actually raising funds to help the communities with whatever their needs may be, whether it's security needs or social services, education, children, the elderly, whatever. We are there, we receive the requests from the communities, and then we put them out there to you, to Christians. All of these project requests are on our website, which is cfoic.com. CFOIC stands for Christian Friends of Israeli Community. So that's cfoic.com. And on our website, you have the full list of all our projects and what we're raising funds for. And I have to say that Christian friends from all over the world have been amazingly generous, and we have been able to do so much. I have to tell you, in the last 2 years alone, we have purchased so many security cameras and all kinds of other equipment for communities that I can safely say today that hundreds of thousands of people are sleeping better today than they did 2 or 3 years ago because of the assistance that you and people like you have provided for these communities. So that more or less is, what I have to say, but I know we still have more time. John, perhaps, do you have any questions or something you'd like me to address that I haven't yet done?
No, I mean, it's great what you've shared with us. I mean, Daphne and I had the privilege of meeting you actually in your community, and very impressed with what you have. Perhaps you could just touch on the relationship with the Arab communities the other side of the road.
Okay, absolutely. So we are surrounded by Arab villages. There's one immediately to the west of us. There's one across the road. And those relationships used to be a lot better. Today, it's much more tense. The community just to the west of us is known to be a hotbed of Hamas. So it's certainly not a place where we're just going to walk in and say hi and shop and whatever. However, there are Arabs that come out of all of the communities in the area and come and work in our communities. And so on an individual level, we are able to create relationships. The people who are coming into our communities or who are working in some of the local factories, these are people who have all been vetted by the security services. So we know that they are not terrorists. Of course, you never know for sure. All kinds of crazy things have happened. But for the most part, these are people who want to work and support their families. And these are people that we can have relationships with. And of course, we wish and we hope that, our Arab neighbors would stop trying to kill us and just realize that we're here to stay. And if they accept us, they will have better lives. Because none of us want this ongoing security checkpoints and secret services and all that kind of stuff that goes on. But we have no choice. I mean, just a couple nights ago, the Secret Service identified and caught a number of terrorists they were already on their way to Israel with a car full of ammunition and explosives on their way to a terrorist attack in one of the cities in Israel. So, we have to be on guard because this is really what's going on. But we hope that, there'll be a different reality. Absolutely. I just realized I didn't talk at all about Passover. Do you want me to say a few words about that? Okay, so Passover is a great holiday. It's actually my favorite holiday, even though it's a holiday we work hardest for beforehand. You'll know the commandments that begin in Exodus 12. We have the first time that God actually gives us the commandments of what Passover is, and it's given actually actually before the Exodus even takes place. I mean, they say, okay, this is what's going to happen. You're going to leave Egypt and you have to bring a Passover sacrifice. And we know that in the temple times, that was a major part of the celebration, the bringing of the Passover sacrifice in the temple. But we also know from the Bible that we don't eat any bread, any leavened products. And so we basically turn our kitchens upside down. We remove, actually, we even have different dishes and different pots and pans, and we remove all of the food that we normally have. We use up all of our bread and cake and cookies. So it's a time of getting fat, during this time before Passover, because you eat a lot of cookies. And I just had my whole family over on Shabbat afternoon and pulled out all the leftover cake that had been in my freezer and just said, everybody eat away. We got to use this stuff up. But it's a lot of work. And of course, we have a big Seder, which is what developed thousands of years ago as a way of telling the Passover story, the amazing miracle of the Exodus from Egypt. And there's a lot of things that we do during the Passover Seder that reminds us of both the difficult times of slavery and the miracle of salvation and freedom. And I think if there's a theme that runs through not only the Passover Seder, but runs through our lives, there are actually two themes. One is, what is the real meaning of freedom? And the second is, what is our obligation to pass these meanings on? So if you talk about freedom, if you go through, particularly in the book of Exodus, every time God speaks about freeing the nation, he's saying, and you will be for me as a nation. And so basically what God is saying is that I'm switching masters, okay? It's not that we leave Egypt and we become free to do whatever we want. God is not introducing anarchy into our lives so that everybody can wake up one morning and, oh, I decide I'm going to rob a bank today. Oh, great. Tomorrow I think I'm going to kill somebody. Oh, great. No. God is freeing us from oppression, from a master that has no business being someone's master. Slavery is absolutely unacceptable. The idea that a person can be a slave to another person is unacceptable. But at the same time, God is turning us into his servants, okay? Which means he's giving us a set of rules that we need to obey. But it's very interesting, that set of rules is supposed to free us. And I think this is really a concept of freedom that it's the Jewish Bible that introduced to the world, a freedom that is not anarchy, but a freedom that is a freedom from slavery to another human being, a freedom from being enslaved to your own whims, to your own fears, to all kinds of things that can paralyze you from doing what you need to do. But when God gives you a way of life, combined with a series of commandments that help you pursue that way of life, at the end of the day, that is maximum freedom, because you are able to say, no, I do not have to listen to you. I do not have to do any of this stuff. Your boss, you're this, you're that, can come upon you with calls and obligations, and you can say, no, not yet. You have to say yes to your boss when he wants you to do your job. But if your boss were to come to you and put upon you an obligation that you know is wrong, you have an anchor and you can say, no, God says no, and therefore I can say no. God has given me that freedom to say yes and no based upon the choices that I should be making. So that's, I think, a very important theme of this holiday. And the second theme, and this is how really is fundamental to Judaism, God says to us over and over again, we need to tell the story to our children. Okay, even in Genesis 12, right after he gives these commandments for the first time, he says, when he talks about this, he says, this is in Genesis 12, verse 26. And when your children will say to you, what is all of this? What is all of this worship? And you explain to them, this is the Passover sacrifice for God, because God passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he sent the plagues to Egypt and our houses were saved. Okay, so from the beginning, there's an obligation, and that obligation to tell your children is repeated over and over again. And this, I believe, is the secret to Jewish continuity, because beginning with the Passover Seder, but throughout our year, we have this obligation to teach our children. And it's only when every family, every parent sees that it is their personal obligation to convey the traditions, the beliefs, the Bible to their children so that it will continue going forever, that we know that we are going to survive, and we will survive as God's people. And it's Passover that really anchors this whole idea, but it's something that we take with us into our lives as Jews all the time.
Well, thank you so much for that insight into Passover, and thank you for the challenge that we actually teach our children the Bible.
Yes.
Thank you for that, and you know, it's our responsibility as parents rather than others to teach as well. So thank you so much for that. Now, could you just remind us of the website we can you know, look on the internet so that we can, if we want to more information about Christian Friends for Israeli Communities,
Okay.
and
It's
plug into your Torah teachings as well.
Right. Okay. So I just sent it in the chat. It's cfoic.com. And yes, we have information there about Judea and Samaria. We have interesting articles, but we have teachings new teachings, at least 2 new teachings every single week. Okay. We have a teaching on the Torah portion that goes out every Friday, which is pre-recorded. And I do a live Zoom session once a week. We are today finishing the book of Joshua, and we'll be starting after the holiday of Passover. We'll be starting the book of Judges. So it's a wonderful opportunity for people to join us live. And it's at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, UK time. So hopefully that's convenient for many people. But all of our teachings, even those that are done live by Zoom, are also recorded, and they're all available on our website. So, you know, enjoy the website. It's an amazing resource, and I think you can learn a lot and enjoy it. And I welcome all of you really to check in and connect with us. And I would love to hear from all of you personally.
Well, Sondra, thank you again for your time and all the insights you've given us. And we're going to shortly pray about what the Lord's put on our hearts from here, listening to you. And maybe just pray for you as well and your community, that the Lord will continue to bless you, and may his name be glorified in all that you're doing. So again, Sondra, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you.